Welcome to the Stewart Squared podcast. We are going to have a great conversation about a bunch of different stuff. We're really starting with the knowledge management of the early internet. I've been trying to build a database and get into vectorized databases, and I did a great episode with Crazy Wisdom about just what is the internet and linked data. Linked data seems to be the most important part, and this all has to do with URIs, uniform resource identifiers, and like the infrastructure of the internet is the next generation of the infrastructure of civilization. Previously, we had libraries, which helped us treat knowledge as a resource. And then the internet showed up, and I don't understand it. And you were there while it was, both of us were there, but you were actually helping to create knowledge about the internet. And I want to understand, how did that happen in the 90s? Is like, what even is the internet, and how do we, understand it? Any thoughts there?
I'll just start by saying, no, you weren't there. You were born in 1985, and some of the stuff we're talking about here was actually invented before that.
Uh,
Um, because the internet grew out of a government project sponsored by DARPA. And the basic premise was make a distributed network that would survive a nuclear blast. And so the idea was to have many different computers cooperating with each other so that if some section of them were taken out by a nuclear blast, the rest of them would keep working. Um, and it would be persistent enough that even if 80% of the network was taken out, there'd still be 20% functioning. So that was the premise. And that was came up with it back during the Cold War when we're all worried about being blown up. And that has evolved over now many decades. But it became functional when they built the network between the universities, and the universities had network connections between each other that were big enough, fast enough, and capable enough that they could do email and basic stuff, file sharing. And so for each of these functions that were happening in what's now known as the internet, there had to be a protocol for it to work, right? So that all of the universities on the network were operating on the same standards. So TCC, TCP, all the damned acronyms that exist that form the basis for the internet are all still there. And you reminded me about your universal resource
I did.
identifier, um, which is closely related to URL, which is Universal Resource Locator. So, right, so you got to identify it, you got to locate it. It's all this really basic stuff, right? That if you just think it through, it's all there. And it's not that hard to understand. It's just that one level gets put on top of another level and it starts to become very complicated. And this is true of everything that happens in the technology business. You start with a very simple idea, and then you make it more and more functional and more uh, broad, and it becomes more and more complicated. And it's underlying one of the points of view I have is that at some point there has to be a reset, which is why I'm thinking about Apple Intelligence, Amazon Alexa Plus, Google Search, and so on and so forth, because AI is creating a situation where it probably needs to be a reset, and
And what,
nobody's done.
but I mean, are you talking about reset at the company level, or are you talking about reset at the like are all these companies, is Apple going away?
Well, it could be. That's one of the issues is like Microsoft was considered to be a has-been until Satya Nadella reestablished its relevance. IBM says still worth like $80 billion, like, but it's a has-been, right? It's not actually influencing where things are going. Um, so there's always this dichotomy between, you know, what's going on now and who's really playing in that. Um, and what used to go on and are the same companies in that mix. And the fact about Microsoft still being relevant is actually unusual.
Mhm.
Usually companies get comfortable, and like I've always had a lot of respect for Michael Dell, but Dell is no longer a relevant company in what's happening on the edge. So it's always a duality.
And then we got the
And
geopolitics because China just released yet another foundational, just crazy thing that undercuts all of our foundational labs with autonomous agents. autonomous agents.
Talking about DeepSeek or something
No,
else?
no, a new one just this weekend, and it's actually competitive to DeepSeek. Another random Chinese company that is not part of any of the big tech
Right.
companies in China.
So the thing I have to caution you on is China did not do that. It was a company in China did
Yeah.
that.
Mhm.
Yeah. Now they have to play by their rules,
Yeah.
but they're still acting independently, and it's not like China
Mm.
Inc. knows that these things are happening. They're going like, "Oh my God, look what DeepSeek did! No, oh, look what this one did," and they're paying attention to Baidu and Tencent and all the other big companies, which are not actually the ones doing the kind of revolutionary stuff. In fact, all four of the really big major Chinese internet companies have all decided to adopt DeepSeek as part of their
Oh, interesting.
infrastructure.
But it, like, I get it. I get that they may not have started with the CCP in the back door, but I don't see any way that the CCP doesn't then just do directly what they would do with Jack Ma, which is like play.
No, they don't have
Uh,
to anymore because all of the entrepreneurs, all the companies in China are already cooperating with the
yeah, yeah,
party. And so the issue is how well does the party understand what these guys are doing?
that's a good
The
question.
party
Okay,
had no idea DeepSeek was doing what it was doing
that's a good question.
until,
How do you know
did
that?
they figure it out because they saw the US companies reacting to it, or did they know themselves but what DeepSeek was doing was important?
Yeah. Yeah, okay. So now I get what you were trying to say a couple weeks ago, where it's essentially that it's whether the CCP understands the technology enough to know where to look. Like that's the major thing.
Well, I mean, just think of the Great Wall, uh, the
Great
what are they
firewall.
called? The Great Firewall.
Yeah.
At a time when firewalls were not particularly well understood anywhere, the party instituted a desire and objective to build the Great Firewall around China, and they have succeeded in doing it. It was pretty leaky in the beginning, but
Yeah.
it's now pretty well
Yeah.
established, and so you give them credit for doing that. And I don't even know if that started when Xi Jinping was chairman of the party or not, but
Oh, that's a good question.
because the internet came before that.
So
Um,
this puts us right back into the thing I wanted to understand, and with a whole new angle, which is the China and the Great Firewall. Why did China need a Great Firewall? Not geopolitically, like technically, with all these URIs, with Tim Berners-Lee. What was going on in the 90s that allowed China to see this?
here's a little thing.
Yeah,
Here's a little thing. The internet was invented by Westerners, mostly English speaking. So URI stands for Universal Resource Identifier. That's all English, right? So anybody that had to program in China had to learn English
yeah.
and be good enough at it to figure out the technical part in the way that you can speak tech in Spanish now. Um, so, uh, so a lot of the sort of underlying concepts of the internet in China are still in English, right? And personally, I don't know how they program in Mandarin or wherever. I think they still have to program in English. And even though when you read about it, it's all expressed in Chinese characters, um, and they can interact with consumers in Mandarin. Um, so that's the part I just don't know, actually, is are universal resource indicators still used in China? I think they have to be. Did they get translated in Mandarin and Chinese characters, or are they still in Western?
Do they have a whole
And
ID?
English predominates even in other languages, right? The French and everybody else has to learn English in order to interact with computers. It's a little bit like the air traffic control system. Um, so that's one thing that's just put that in your head and chew on it for a while because it is relevant that all this stuff started essentially in the U.S. Um, there were instances in Europe, but really only in Europe, uh, not even in Japan. So
Hmm.
um, the the
The Great Firewall, the internet.
but the Great Firewall was expressed as something that was important to a centralized party like the Chinese Communist Party. And so it was pretty quick that China was going like, oh, 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 look what's going on here. This is like all that stuff they're talking about in the US. We don't want that to happen here. We don't want everybody to be able to say anything they want. The Tiananmen Massacre was in 89.
Yeah.
think it was. And right there, that was a big thing because that photo of that guy standing in front of the tanks got distributed worldwide,
Yeah.
and and the
Yeah.
Communist Party couldn't prevent that.
But that was not the internet, though, that did that. That was just media. That was just Western media in 1989 that was able to do that.
Yeah,
Yeah. But
yeah,
then
yeah.
they saw the
Right. So
Western media,
the
they
internet.
saw the TV, they saw all these things, and I've
So they
actually,
are already trying to control media,
yeah.
right? And it evolved. It wasn't perfect back then. So it's like everything, they had to figure out what it was. And then the internet came along, and they're going like, oh yeah, this is even worse. We got to like, that's when the big firewall,
And
the Great Firewall.
I've got the history here. So the Great Firewall of China, also known as the Golden Shield Project, that's a good name. It was started
I think
in,
it compared to Golden Dome. You know what I mean by Golden Dome?
yeah, the Iron Dome, right, in
Trump's
Israel.
calling it,
Oh,
Israel's got the Iron Dome,
we've
and we
got the
want the
Golden
Golden
Dome
Dome
now.
because everything Trump does is golden.
Which is a whole other thread that we can talk about later. But the project was initiated by China's Ministry of Public Security in 1998. First phase lasted 8 years and was completed in 2006. The second phase began in 2006 and ended in 2008. 2000 on December 6, 2002, 300 people in charge of the project from 31 provinces and cities throughout China participated in a 4-day inaugural comprehensive exhibition on Chinese information system. It's estimated that 30 to 50,000 police were employed in this large-scale project, and it officially went online in 2003. So 98 to 2003, before the internet boom, they were on, or before the internet bust, they were on it. Um,
So
so
you start thinking about knowledge management, think about that. Managing knowledge in a country with 1.4 billion people and a gigantic landmass. Um, so I had a personal experience. This is just I'm going to tell you this.
yeah,
I went to China early. This is like 20 years ago, maybe 18, because I think it was right after I left NEA, or it might have been right at the while I was at NEA. And I have to go back to find the time, but Microsoft flew me and the managing partner of NEA to China, to Beijing, and we participated in a panel session on hardware and software
hmm,
and venture capital. And
hmm,
a lot of it was about venture capital. And so he talked venture capital and I talked technology, software, and what software meant. Um, this was organized by, and I'll forget the names, but the Ministry of Information Technology, whatever the hell it was called at the time. And there were two ministries, the Ministry of Information Technology and the Ministry of Computing, I think it was. And uh, the Ministry of Information Technology is the one that organized it. They organized it in a hotel they owned. They owned the hotel. So they put on this meeting
yeah,
in the hotel that they owned, but the Information of Computer Technology um, was a co-sponsor, and they were both there. And so they had to go through this whole protocol about the Minister of Information Technology and the Minister of Computing Technology, and everything had to be very programmed very carefully. Uh, and
wow,
I walked away from that going, oh my God, like the government is thinking about me being in China talking about computers. And Peter, the managing partner, are talking about venture capital, and they're talking about venture capital and trying to figure out how to do venture capital in a centralized planned economy. It says really it was surreal. I
yeah,
also did a bunch of stuff in Beijing and went through the Forbidden Palace, and it was a great trip. But that experience of going to that was one of the most amazing things. And so I've always had that in my head as I've gone through all of the other experiences I've had
yeah,
regarding China.
yeah. Well, it's really interesting the timing on that, given we just figured out that 1998 was when they instituted the Great Firewall. So it's probably part of that initial kind of thinking like, oh, okay, we're going to shut this
I
thing
think,
down.
I think before that, and that's the part I'm trying to remember exactly when it happened. It must have been with NAA because I went with Peter. So it was after I'd left Infold
Uh,
in the late 90s.
so I'm
I,
going to make a note to go ask you later. When did you go to China with NEA?
I've been to China like 5 times, so I have more than one experience.
Yeah. So they were doing this in 1998. what like let's go back to the URL. Like what is the internet and why do they need what the fact like I just figured it out. It's so crazy that I've been using URLs for so long, but now I realize that the front part of the URL, the www.x.com, I don't mean that X in the company, but just like whatever's in that .com, and then there's a whole bunch of numbers afterwards. Now I'm realizing that that's there's the thing which holds all the numbers, and then the numbers get you to a specific part in that thing that holds all the numbers. Why is that
Do
so?
you know what a MAC address is?
No,
MAC.
no.
Look it up because I can't
Yeah,
remember myself. But
yeah.
MAC address is the identifier for the computer itself, the actual piece of hardware. iPhones have them. Every device on the internet has a MAC address. And it's not Mac like Apple Mac. It stands for something. Um, so all the protocols have to operate against something that they can identify uniquely. Um, and unique identification is really critical in this whole thing because it can't ever have people, the signals get confused as data is transferring across the network. It can't be confused about what it's going to, right? If there's two of them and they look identical, then shoo, boom, it's all screwed up. Um, and in Ethernet, which is the local area network, um, the thing that Bob Metcalfe did, who was said to have invented the Ethernet, um, is pretty sure of this, and I'm a little weak on it, but he invented collision avoidance
Mm,
protocols
mm,
on the internet. So if two pieces, I don't even know what's colliding, right? It's not atoms, or it's probably bits with some collection of bits so they can avoid each other. This is like pretty extreme. But it's at this level that any network has to operate. Any set of computers that are communicating with each other have to have, right? Because it's just ones and zeros. And it gets into what really is intelligence. But
mm.
at the base level, computers have to know for sure what's going on.
Wait. So yeah, okay. And so Bob Metcalfe in 1973 co-invented the Ethernet at Xerox PARC. So 10 years, 20 years before DARPA created well, no, sorry.
The other way around. The other way around.
What do you mean?
When were the internet protocols invented?
Okay.
What's the source here? What was the first project that DARPA funded that led to the internet?
Yeah. Invented. So I didn't have time to get the DARPA, what is the first project, but when were the internet protocols invented? They were invented in the 1970s. Foundation for modern internet protocols was laid by Vint Cerf and Bob
Yep,
Kahn.
yep.
Um, so this is TCP, which is Transmission Control Protocol, and Internet
Slash
Protocol,
protocol.
TCP IP.
TCP/IP.
Okay, got it.
Yeah.
And then the work incorporated concepts from the Cyclades network and marked the beginning of the modern internet era. So that's where the internet protocol, that's why
That's the early 70s,
yeah.
right? And the first personal computers were created in the mid 70s.
Wow, interesting. So this is before the personal computer. It was large networks, like you said. I believe the UCLA was the first one. But
Yeah,
then,
that's why they say that the internet coast or something like that, the digital coast. In LA, they like to think that the internet was invented there. But you can't just have one. There's no real value in having a network at UCLA that only is on
yeah,
UCLA. It only becomes useful if it's cooked to MIT and Stanford, and right. So um, the academics saw the value of this way before it started to become commercial, and it was protected as a resource because it was funded by the government for academia and where it intersects with the government. There was no concept that it would be commercial in any time. It just had to be secure because remember the nuclear blast thing. Um,
Mhm.
and so they had to piece together all the protocols that would work in a network like that. And
So what's the
TCP
protocol? What is a protocol?
protocol is just an agreement that what
Yeah.
you say is understood by what you hear.
So you needed a language to connect UCLA and Stanford. You needed a language that the machines would
And
understand.
language is the wrong word to use. because language runs on top of protocols are just, so if you're going to create an operating system, it can know what the two endpoints are um, in a network and what's coming in through the network and what you're putting out back over the network. And it's very hard. This is like the squishiest thing in the world. This is where I ended up going when I started. What's the difference between hardware and software? Because like software is embedded in hardware
Yeah.
and software operates independently of hardware. It's like, what are the this is computing. The farther you get into the details, the more you find out it's really simple, but it's also at the same time incredibly complex.
And abstract and really hard to visualize because
Yeah.
it's all these things that are going on. And this is just like, and it seems very different from other revolutions in civilization. For example, just like the oil revolution. The oil revolution seems really easy to understand because you put the oil in the car gets me around everywhere. I understand that.
I
But
had to get it out of the ground. There's some complexity there. And you have to distribute it, refine it, distribute it, get it into the gas tank. Or railroads or airplanes. I mean, air traffic control is a really fascinating thing. And at some level, Doge has begun to reveal how bad our air traffic control system is. And it just by happenstance, we happen to be having a bunch of airplane crashes. And so, you know, all systems are complex at some level. Like even how you distribute electricity and how that works is pretty interesting.
yeah.
Um, and so systems are complex, and the internet's just another system. It just tends to be a little more complex.
Well, and it's abstract and it's information based and it's in the background because I can't see the internet. I can see the car, I can see the refineries, I can see the railroads, I can see all of those things. Those are all in the physical world. Like I have examples from my visual vision that I've seen before. Whereas the computer, all I see is this computer. Like I don't see the internet.
Yeah, software is soft. There was a phrase that during the PC industry is that hardware companies fail hard, software companies fail soft. And that's part of the business, right? And hardware, you have to manufacture stuff or at least assemble it, and you have to have factories. And so if you screw up a hardware company, it's expensive and horrible. Software companies can go on forever. I mean, we still have software companies that were big deals back in the 80s
Yeah.
that are still operating. We just don't think about them very much because
What are some
you know,
examples?
relevant. Uh, Oracle's just barely relevant. Oracle has bought a lot of those companies. Uh, e EMC. EMC is a big enterprise software company. And I don't even remember what EMC stands for, but it's kind of like IBM, International Business Machines, EMC. I can't
Um,
remember what it's.
and so was EMC relevant to your career? Did you have any interactions with them?
Very rare, very loosely. EMC has bought a bunch of companies, I think it bought a company that bought one of my companies. So it's a big enterprise company. It's like mainframes. This is what I was saying when I was at Inc. that nobody really cared about mainframes because they couldn't see them. It's a little bit what you're talking about. Well, EMC runs these huge systems. I mean, there are companies behind the banking system that are, worth billions of dollars, but nobody's interested.
Hmm.
Unless it doesn't work, but that's a different issue.
So I've got a list of them. BMC Software, founded in 1980.
See
QNX,
that? I remember that BMC. That's it. Yeah.
QNX, Micro Focus International, Intuit,
Yeah.
Autodesk, Adobe, and Broderbund. What is Broderbund?
Broderbund, the
Great
game
name.
company, the Carlson brothers, Doug Carlson. I mean, that was a key part in my world. I went to
Why?
visit the
Explain
Broderbund
more.
company or in Marin County. It's one of the very few companies that went public in Marin County.
Wait. Okay, so Broderbund is the company that went public in Marin County. How did it intersect with your career?
It's a game company. It was a company that one of the first games it published was the Oregon Trail, which was a really critical game that a lot of teachers used to teach geography and um, was going way back. It was mostly on the Apple II, right? So it was
I
before
remember
the
it
IBM.
well. It was one of the big games that got me into it, and I still remember the green screen or the black screen with the green letters. playing around Oregon Trail.
So they did a bunch of games, and they were really important games at the time. But this is pre-IBM. So they did games on that. But once the IBM PC showed up, the game business changed tremendously
Why?
because IBM PC was much better for games, making games. Apple didn't really help game developers, didn't believe in games.
Why did the Mac suck so much for games in the 90s? And why did the
Uh,
PCs?
because the GUI, the user interface, had a lot of overhead that you had to deal with in making a game, and it wasn't relevant to the values of a game, the sort of real-time performance and interactivity. It was too slow and too burdensome. Whereas on a PC, they could do anything they wanted. And originally it was with DOS, right? It wasn't Windows. Windows has not been a really great game environment either.
Well,
Although the Mac then ended up becoming a great game environment, or not the Mac, the iPhone. And
interesting.
we should talk about Next OS at some point.
Yeah,
I
what
mean,
is that?
this is transformational, and I was just looking at a summary of the history of Apple because I was trying to get the context for my thing with to Tim Cook. Um, that the one thing that Gil Amelio did, the third, fourth, fifth CEO of Apple, that last one before Steve came back, um, the one thing he did was he bought Next.
Yeah,
He arranged with Jobs to buy Next.
yeah.
And he knew it, he understood it, because the Next OS, which, if I remember correctly, is loosely based on Unix, the Next OS was built as a real operating system that was independent of the chipset, which has enabled
Wait, wait, wait.
Apple to go from Motorola to Intel to its own chipset.
Oh, interesting. Okay,
That's
so
it's been critical in the history of Apple.
and why did Steve Jobs and I imagine Avi Tenenbaum, why did they choose to do that for Next?
Avi was not the decision maker. Steve was the owner. Um, Avi came along, and actually the team at Next largely came over to Apple because Avi was the software guy for Apple for a long time. um, because Next was failing and he needed a face save. Um, so he agreed to sell Next to
No,
Apple. And there was a kind of loose thing that maybe Steve would get back into Apple, but he didn't have a job. He wasn't even on the board. He kind of wormed his way in and ended up becoming CEO again.
yeah, no, but why did XOS or why did at Next they make the decision to make something independent of the chipset set?
Oh, okay. Well, it's inherent in Unix. Unix is an operating system that's independent of the chipset it's developed for, whereas the original Mac OS was tied very, very closely to the Motorola architecture. They couldn't get off that until they managed to implement Next OS underneath the Mac OS.
And with
That itself was an amazing transition. The fact that they swapped out the kernel, the core portion of the operating system without people knowing. I'm trying to remember when that happened. Um, that was a miracle itself. Not to mention, then they figured out how to get off of Motorola onto Intel, and then off Intel and onto ARM. And so, I mean, a lot of this happened under Tim Cook's, but it was all launched by Steve.
Yeah, but Tim was in the background making all the logistics work.
Yeah, he was the supply chain guy. He's a smart guy. There's
Yeah,
nothing wrong with Tim Cook other than that he's not Steve Jobs. But
yeah,
this is
well,
where it's to show up like 20 years later. The company's worth $3 trillion, maybe four, and Tim's achieved that, but he doesn't understand the underlying technology.
well, and I still don't understand why the Unix part. You said something so interesting, which is the XOS does something without the chips, and you seemed like we got there from IBM making better games and all these things, which like. And I want to talk about the Tim Cook thing you
Let
mentioned.
me sort that out for you. Unix is completely separate from what I was talking about with the
Okay.
IBM. It's a game. And indeed, the game IBM PC was a great game machine because you could address the processor directly. You didn't have to like work around the operating system. You could just do it yourself. So you could do machine coding. Anyway, that's a little bit of a trip sideways. But the Unix was developed at AT&T. There are a number of labs, not just DARPA, but AT&T's lab. Why am I spacing on it?
Yeah,
SRI's lab
Xerox. Bell
There were a bunch of labs where stuff was really invented. And AT&T, I don't really know the history on this because it was after it was broken up. Um, and I think part of the mission for AT&T was to be research for all of the Bells, the individual telephone companies, which some people don't even know about anymore because they all went away. Um, but AT&T needed to have a common operating system. And so they had a research effort to build an operating system that could operate on any hardware. That's Unix.
Okay, and that's in addition to a whole bunch of things. Just keep on opening. So it's in addition to them creating the semiconductor at Bell Labs, they also created Unix.
Yeah, different times.
Yeah,
Bell Labs, uh, which see, I'm sitting here trying to work out exactly where Bell Labs came from, and I think it was originally
I got the history here.
Edison.
So on Bell Telephone Laboratories was established as a subsidiary jointly owned by AT&T and Western Electric. Uh,
And
yeah, so
that's
back in
telegraph.
yeah,
So yeah, in New Jersey,
yeah.
and yeah, Bell Labs. Uh, the the semiconductor, the transistor was really invented during World War II, and
Mm,
um,
mm,
and
yeah.
AT&T failed to do anything with it. So what happened is William Shockley, who worked for AT&T at Bell Labs, moved to California, and he uh, did further iterations of the transistor that turned into the semiconductor. So the semiconductor really was invented in Silicon Valley, even though key part of that was a transistor,
Yeah.
which was invented at Bell Labs. So later, this was during the 50s, maybe even in the 60s, that Bell Labs developed Unix. And Unix, you got to remember this. This came up when we were interviewing my brother Joe. Um, Digital Equipment Corporation did not have software. They built the whole damn thing,
Mhm.
hardware and software all together, right? So if you were a customer, they had to deliver the whole thing and have it work. Um, there was no independent software industry. Um,
Mhm.
and the independent software industry, there were kind of people trying to think about this, but it really didn't happen until you had the personal computer. There were mini computers, and there were some people that would do programming on those mini computers, but they didn't build software independently and distribute it across all of the computers. That happened with the PC. So that's why soft letter was so interesting. We, Jeffrey and I started this newsletter because software was a brand new business. There was no precedent for it. How do you package the stuff and how do you sell it? And how do you price it? All that stuff had to be worked out. And that was why soft letter was an interesting thing to do because we were writing about exactly that, the companies that were inventing software on the fly.
Okay, so now this is much clearer. So Unix was this thing that AT&T Bell Labs created so that they could run their hardware, and it was the first example, or maybe the first most important example of a software that made hardware helpful. And then Unix then spread to all these other companies, including
Very, very slowly,
very
very, very slowly. And Unix became many different things. And I don't know, you could probably look this up too, was Unix in the public domain? Because open source came much later and there was no open source when Unix was developed. So Linux is the open source version of Unix. But DEC had its own Unix, Digital Equipment Corp had its own Unix, IBM had its own Unix. They all implemented Unix in their own way. I don't know if they had to pay license fees to do that. Um, so the concept of Unix was attractive to people in the industry as it developed, but there was no level of standardization like happened with the IBM PC and MS-DOS. That was the first operating system which really was standard and could be implemented on any computer as long as the computer had the right BIOS, but
bias
and
related to the chip.
firmware. Yeah, firmware software that's embedded in hardware. So DOS had to have the Phoenix BIOS. There's a bunch of components in there in order to operate on a Compaq and an Osborne.
Okay, all right. Now, much more interesting, and that kind of answers a lot of the fundamental questions about what the internet is, because internet connects Unix-based systems together, and the internet has the URIs so that it can then find, or no, it has the other one that you mentioned, the media thing, Mac. Uh,
Address.
each
I don't know if the computers back then had a MAC address. It might be that, that's as a result of the personal computer because they're stamped out.
Okay. We'll put a pin in in this
Yeah,
really
history of
nerdy.
the MAC.
Yeah, yeah. Hopefully we still have some listeners listening to all this. The okay, so now let's move into Apple. Tim Cook, you're writing a Substack. Can you make a connection between what everything we just talked about and why? Well, it's the infrastructure, the civilizational infrastructure, the company-wide infrastructure. They're failing.
So they're not failing, obviously, because they make a huge amount of money and they're the most valuable company in the world. You can't say they're failing.
Yeah.
It's the potential for failure.
Uh-huh.
And so how did Microsoft become irrelevant and then become relevant again? Or IBM never did. Um, Apple, uh, in order to stay relevant, you have to understand what the underlying technical issues are. Steve was able to do this,
China.
and 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 other people can do that too. Does Sam Altman understand this? You
Mm,
cannot continue to move a company forward without an inherent understanding of the technology. Um, so Tim's done amazing things at Apple, but all of them really did trade on decisions that Steve had made, including doing their own silicon.
mm,
And
mm,
all the chips that are coming out in Macs since the first Apple chip was implemented, um, either the A chips for the iPhone or the M chips for the Macintosh, um, are designed using the ARM architecture, but they're implemented by Apple and manufactured by TSMC.
mm,
And Apple was the first company to be able to do that, to uh, build the design the chip, build the chip through TCS, and build all the operating system components, and to have that whole thing work effectively and deliver real value. Um, so a lot of the value of Macintosh now is that it actually outperforms Windows machines because it's so well integrated. Um, so all of that started with Steve's desire to control everything, right? To design everything in the computer. And it just pissed him off to no end that he was dependent first on Motorola and then on Intel. And so the ARM thing didn't happen until after he died, but he'd started the process. And that is Tim's mastery. The entire vertical integration from silicon all the way to Apple stores, right? Everything is under Apple's control all the way through that, except for TSMC, and Foxconn because they do the assembly in China. um, so Apple controls the whole stack from top to bottom and has been effective in making that useful enough that people will certainly buy iPhones, but also their best performing division this last quarter was the Macintosh, went up 16%. And so the value of the underlying technology to Macintosh is significant and compelling. And so, but he's trading on all the things that were started at Apple previously. So the new stuff where there's really a difference, like iPad was just a bigger iPhone at some level. Um,
mm,
Apple TV is kind of like an embedded iPhone
mm.
attached to your TV with a big screen. So all the things they've done have all been architecturally extensions, and that's what Tim's really good at doing is managing the extensions. AI is a problem because it's clear he personally doesn't get it.
Yeah.
Um, and he's very famous for his incredibly stable management team, very few of whom have ever left.
No,
In fact, he's a whole
and no one gets
system of
it. No one on the management team gets it.
That's it, a whole management team. So at the management level, you have to know who knows in
Yeah.
order to put them in
Uh,
charge, right? And so
uh,
they just kept it. It's just a Siri thing. They just said new version of Siri,
yeah.
basically. It's gonna You can talk to it and blah blah blah. And that's not actually what AI is all about. Now, the comparison is, well, how are all the big tech companies dealing with this?
No one understands it.
No, no, I give Satya Nadella. I think he gets it, right?
Interesting.
terms of a business opportunity and challenge for Microsoft, he did not depend on his own technology. He went out and did a deal with the hot company and bound them in, like, but he didn't bind them in a way that committed Microsoft to always use OpenAI. So now he's like going, okay, yeah, we've got some other stuff going on. So he's surfing the technology, and he is a guy who understands his technology intimately, right? It's why Satya is such an interesting person. Um, so, but Amazon's the one that's also interesting at this point, and they just announced Alexa Plus. I actually went out and bought an Echo Show 10 so I could use it, but then I realized when I got it that I'm still using the old Alexa, which is like sucks almost as bad as Siri. And and I started reading up about it. Turns out Amazon actually announced Alexa Plus more than a year ago,
Mm.
missed their deadlines. So
Mm.
they've just announced that it's going to be available soon. Speculation is within a month. Um, and uh, so Amazon itself has had trouble figuring this out. And remember, Amazon is like this gigantic company that does everything, and they have a hardware division, and hardware division is doing Alexa.
And they don't.
Um, so the people that run the hardware division, do they understand AI, or the Alexa people understand AI? They have a really outstanding product manager on it, and so they're better, and they're much more flexible about it. They're not just saying like it's Siri. They do understand what the challenge is. They clearly do because that's what they announced. Apple hasn't even announced that they understand what the problem is. Amazon is good enough that they have announced that they understand what the problem is and they're going to deliver against it. So who else is out there? Well, there's Microsoft, which has Copilot. I've only just realized that Copilot is a separate program. I didn't know that. I thought they were embedding it in all the other apps. So I had never downloaded Copilot.
Yeah.
I don't even know what it is. This is Microsoft's marketing problem. They really don't know how to explain their own stuff.
Uh-huh.
Um, and so who else is out there? Google. Google builds it into search. Everybody's using it now because if you do a Google search, you're getting it. And there's Gemini, and they just introduced, it's funny, they just separated it and made it an app. So you still get it in search, but you can't go to Gemini on the web. You have to download an app now.
So
Um,
I think it's important. I don't know if we talked about this at some point or I got this from somebody else, but I fundamentally believe that LLMs are not software. It seems like there's something else.
who does?
I don't believe that LLMs are software. It feels like it's
Okay.
something different than software. It replaces some parts of the database. So it replaces some parts of the database and in some ways makes it not necessary to have a database. And I want to go into a little bit more on this idea. There's a great book called Technological Revolutions and Financial Capital, The Dynamics of Bubbles and Golden Ages by Carlota Perez. Carlota finds five technology revolutions that are separate: Industrial Revolution, Age of Steam and Railways, Age of Steel and Electricity, Age of Oil and Mass Production, and the Information and Communications Technology, which this show is about. There's two phases. There's the installation period. A new technology emerges, leading to speculative investment and a financial bubble. And then there's the deployment period. After the inevitable crash, productive capital takes over, integrating the technology into widespread use. So I am saying that the LLMs although they're part of the information and communications technology revolution, represent a separate revolution, which is that instead of software, it's a cognitive prosthetic. It's a prosthetic inside, not inside of my brain, but that taps into the knowledge, the language centers of my brain and expands my ability to use language, separate from software and hardware, which were part of the information and communications technology revolution. What do you think about that?
Wow. Uh, let's say, let's take it a little differently and see how this works. Uh, let's say artificial intelligence ends up being a utility
Uh-huh.
available to everybody.
Yep.
Um, the
Mhm.
internet is a utility.
Yep.
Access to the internet is a utility. Now primarily provided by uh, cable companies,
Mm.
because when you plug a cable into a house, you get high performance, high
Mhm.
broadband network, and they've been building out the capability of the infrastructure to deliver that. Now challenged by Starlink at some level because they've kind of caught up very quickly and can compete on price and performance. Um, there's no inherent value to me as an individual in which way I connect to the internet.
Mm.
Uh, and so what you're positing about LLMs, it's not a matter of whether it's hardware or software, but it is now becoming a utility.
Mhm.
And there
Mhm.
are very large companies that provide utility and
Mhm.
operate on a very thin margin
Mm.
and where there's real value, shareholder value. And this is precisely what everybody's talking about is, well, the foundational models are becoming a commodity. And who has the resources to be able to provide that uh, utility value um, permanently, right? Because if you go out of business, then it doesn't work. So um, that's why that $500 billion Stargate thing was
Yeah.
pretty interesting because, it's Oracle and Sansan and Sam Altman standing up there with Trump going, yeah, we're going to build essentially a utility. It's a server farm, so LLMs operate on that. But at some point, I think maybe server farms and LLMs will become merged,
Absolutely.
and
Oh.
it'll just be something that people provide because the real value is in the reasoning, um, the inference, all the things that are being talked about now. And so I believe that we have hit the wall, the scale wall, if you will, right? Our foundational, you can't tell the difference anymore. It's
Yeah.
3.5,
Yeah.
4.2, or whatever the hell it
Yeah.
is. They're all normalizing around a basic set of functionality, and the distinguishing parts will be the intelligence, the reasoning, and so, so I think we come to the same place, just express it differently.
Yeah. And so this leads to a question that I've been on my mind. Has there ever been a period in which something commoditized, not only
Absolutely,
commoditized, but is so
absolutely.
incredibly important and also commoditized really quickly?
So the internet bubble
Yeah.
um,
With
wasn't
yeah.
it was hidden behind that, but the telecoms companies were themselves going through a transition anyway because we're going from the five bells to
Mm.
internet providers and infrastructure providers and cell towers and all these other things were going on. But there was a belief that installing fiber would be critical to the future of the internet. And so companies started actually digging trenches and putting fiber into those trenches across the country. They often did it alongside railroads because railroads already had the right of way so they just bury a cable next to the railroad. And um, those
Wow.
companies were worth a lot of money in 2000. In the first quarter of 2001, their value exploded. It was actually after the internet bubble um,
Huh.
because they realized the economics weren't going to work out, but they did lay the fiber. So we have this huge fiber network now in the US. And after that, other companies came along and bought those assets really cheap and turned them into high-speed networks. And a lot of those are owned by cable companies. And um, so, or they're like cell towers, right? They're infrastructure. Who owns cell towers? Actually, the cellular companies don't own the cell towers. Cell towers are a separate business, and they know how to build the cell towers and manage them. And the cell companies operate on as lessees, if you will. And so, understanding that whole infrastructure is really important, but um, fiber is critical. Because another part here, we have worldwide fiber optic cabling for the internet. One of the issues that's going on right now is that Norway is determining, or is it Finland? Finland, one of those countries
Yeah.
is determining if the Russians are trying to cut the cables
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
off
Well,
their
and
fishing boats.
And I found out well, and China's been doing it, with the trawlers, the fishing trawlers. They'll just, oh, oops, accidentally cut off that internet.
Oops. Yeah.
It reminds me also, a friend of mine recently told me about so you've got all the telecoms that you've been talking about, and those telecoms, how do they connect with someplace like Norway? It's through those underlying the cables. But again, with the cables, there's also a software layer, and apparently the Russians have been going in and gaining access to that software layer, and then intercepting things going through that software layer. I think it's called
Theory
PC.
that all the traffic running on those cables is encrypted and it can't
Yeah.
be hacked,
Uh-huh,
but
uh-huh. But there are all these
it's
exploits. There are all these little tiny exploits that we can't think of that not maybe the encryption doesn't work, but there's some other random thing that does it. Um, okay, so let's go back to why Tim Cook and why the management team, why they can't understand it, because there's something philosophical there, which is about language and philosophy and linguistics and all these different things that they don't get. Do you agree with that? And if you do agree with that, what is that thing? Like, what is the thing at the central layer of LLMs that they don't understand?
um, okay. I'll start a little higher level than that.
Yeah.
The one organization that Apple is compared to frequently is the CIA,
Hmm. Whoa.
because it's an incredibly secretive, closed
Ah,
system, right? It's also could be compared to the CCCP,
yeah.
and the in a closed system, you don't get a lot of uh, foreign material,
Yeah. Yeah.
you
Yeah.
know.
Yeah.
And so there's a very strong culture at Apple that if you work at Apple, you really have to be part of to be successful. So over time, it becomes more and more centralized, more and more.
Mm,
Uh, uh, Actually, the other one is Japan. It can be compared to, but homogenous. And uh, the and this is an organizational problem that happens over very long periods of time. I'm relatively speaking to business. Um, And this has been a huge strength during this period of time when they were essentially rebuilding the whole stack from the chip level all the way up through. Their applications still suck, but there are other alternatives at that level. And so um, anybody that's out there in the world, even if they're in San Francisco and you're one of the anointed 100 people that really understand what's going on, don't really understand what's going on, right? This is an area where no one can tell you exactly what's going to happen in the future, and we're all arguing about it. In an environment like that, none of that leaks into Apple.
uh,
There's no, it's all so tightly controlled. Even their policy for publishing papers, right? There's a big push in academia to publish papers to prove your worth. And Google and Facebook and all these guys are participating fully in that. Apple's never done that. They do put some papers out now, kind of reluctantly, but there is no effort to bring a different way of thinking about things into the company. And it's the most severe problem at Apple because Apple is the most valuable company in the world because of that culture.
yeah.
And so it's a real conundrum if they even wanted to change the culture, right? I think Tim Cook is like 63 or something now. And so the question is there a succession plan?
Mm.
Which there does not appear to be. So then you compare it to other companies, right? Microsoft already went through its bad time with Steve Ballmer and Satya Nadella has rebuilt the whole culture, and he's still putting that together. So he's still very open-minded about what does OpenAI mean, and are they capable of it, or do they need to work with other people? Amazon isn't really even a technology company, although it is a technology company in the sense of being a retailer, but they've got some amazing things like Amazon Web Services and the Kindle operation and Echoes. And so they're still relatively open-minded. Plus, they have a new CEO, uh, what the fuck is his name? Andy Sassy. And, he's trying to prove himself after having to take Bezos's place. So this is a thing that happens in companies all the time. Can you stay relevant
Yeah.
as you get bigger? And Apple has been so relevant and so amazingly cultural in sync with its customer base that it has billions of customers. So what's the only threat that could come along but something? So you go all the way back to Bill Gates's internet memo. Have you ever
Mm.
read it?
Mm.
It was basically saying, this is really important. We must understand this. And they still couldn't understand it, even though the CEO wrote a public memo about how important this was. Um, the Organizations are really hard to change once they become embedded and encrusted and all those kind of things. So Apple is, what's the threat to Apple? Well, should Tim Cook introduce new products, the watch, the iPad, the Apple TV,
Hard.
they spent a few billion to build cars, but it didn't matter. What's the one thing that could threaten Apple?
They,
It's not understanding artificial intelligence from the point of view of its own design
yeah,
principle.
yeah,
It's it's now public. They announced it. This is the tack I'm taking in the Substack is Steve, when he came back as CEO, put down a rule, which not too many people really know was a rule. No product will be announced until it's available. Which in the technology business is really hard to do because you have to keep the whole development cycle secret
yeah,
so that people don't know about it. And then bloop, you pop up and go, look, here's a product, and you can go buy it in the store. Um, and they did that for the last 15 years. But you've noticed that they've begun to announce products before they're available.
yeah,
A week or two, a month, a quarter. Apple Intelligence was announced by Apple before it knew it could finish the product.
yeah. Way
And
before,
that
way
that's
before.
called that's
They,
that's called vaporware.
yeah.
I used to run the vaporware list in my newsletter. And the top product on the vaporware list for 3 years was Windows because Microsoft did a competitive announcement. Oh, we're going to have a graphical user interface too, and it's called Windows. And it took them 3 years to actually
Oh
deliver a
man,
product.
interesting. Um, so this is really interesting because I bought an iPhone expecting them to get it. And then they did not get it. And now everyone's telling me about the Pixel that they're buying. And I'm like, oh shit, I just left the Pixel and I can install the Graphene OS, which allows you to have full control over the whole software, everything like that. And I'm stuck in the iPhone. I'm glad I did it because it is in some ways better. In other ways, worse and declining faster. Um,
Not
um,
necessarily, but yeah.
yeah, there was
I
a
mean, my thesis is that this will be Apple's bête noire. Um, I'm not alone in this.
what is
It's
a
now
bet
public. We're talking about bête noire. They're come to Jesus moment. What I don't even know if I'm using that correctly.
Okay, so last 5 minutes, like what is it still that they're not getting, like and everyone else is not getting it, and also it seems like nobody gets it as you've been talking about, and it's getting harder to get it because so much is happening. So the ability to integrate all the information coming out is not possible for one person, let alone a group of people. Oh, the culture. I remember the culture part. So you mentioned various countries as well in terms of having this stable monolithic culture, including Japan and China, and also CIA, CCP, and Apple. One thing I've been on the thread of is that Argentina needs a cultural change in order to instantiate what Javier Milei is talking about. In some ways, the United States also needs a cultural reinvigoration in order to capture this golden age that people are talking about. So how do you change culture? Uh,
Mhm.
yeah,
Only change culture by something really bad happening.
yeah,
Uh,
the dark
the
night.
uh, uh, the bubonic plague,
Yeah,
uh, nuclear power,
yeah,
world wars,
yeah.
diseases, it's stuff like that. And they had to be really bad, right? Having some terrorists knock down a couple of towers in New York City was temporary. Only lasted about 18 months before people went back to what they were thinking. So that wasn't really, really bad. Um, Although terrorism is kind of bad at some level. So uh,
Yeah, the United
so I
States
don't
people
think
did
you can
not sit
change
with
Apple's culture until they have declining revenue. Actually, they did decline in revenue last quarter, but they were more profitable. So it's a managed ecosystem right now. People have to start making the decision not to buy iPhones. That would be, and the whole artificial Apple Intelligence is based on the iPhone. It's not really on the Mac. I mean, who cares about the Mac? It's like this is the thing you talk to. Um,
because
and
that's the thing missing right now is a phone that I can use in the same way that I just talk to it and it like and it does the things that I want it to do.
Amazon just announced the ability to do that with Alexa, which is, I have it in the kitchen. It's not, doesn't go with me. They think they can make it more important to people, but it's still based on your retail Prime membership kind of thing.
Um,
So Apple has, as I've said this repeatedly, Apple has my calendar, my email. Everything that's important to me is on my iPhone. And Apple's opportunity was to start using that data. And that actually was an explicit thing that they said about Apple Intelligence, that they would
yeah.
operate against your personal data without exposing it to the internet. And you could trust them.
Mm,
And fucked up. Does that mean you can't trust Apple? If
mm,
you go back at 20 years of Apple marketing, if you can't trust Apple, that pulls the rug out from under everything. And
the
there's,
brand. Interesting.
yeah.
Is there trust
So
over privacy? Interesting.
God, you're talking me into making my Substack even better. Is this is this the end of Apple?
Yeah. Oh, great. Yeah. And plug there for my services as a private podcasting consultant. So we'll,
Yeah, no, I may end up mentioning it because
yeah.
then, of course, it would also lead me to promote our podcast.
Well, thank you again for a wonderful talk. Next week, we will be interviewing Bill Gross. What's the main question you want to ask Bill Gross?
If we talk to him about AI, he's going to start talking about what's his thing? Um, I can't remember what it's pro rata. And we want to try to avoid having him
Okay.
just
Yeah.
all out pitch pro rata, which
Yeah.
is
Interesting.
probably what he's going to want to do. But so we should probably take that up right in the top and say, right about, tell us about pro rata, but let's get through that and talk about the real thing.
Interesting. I like it. All right. Cool. Next week.